And I will share my screen and we will discuss what scope is. Hey, what are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to talk about scope. What is scope? Types of scope. There's 3 types: global, functional, block, and scope best practices. So diving right in, what is scope? Scope refers to which variables can be accessed by your code at a specific location in your code. So it's really just like we've talked about, like defining variables and the ability to access those variables. And this just refers to the fact that where the variables are defined, where you write something like let wow equals wow, that will make a difference in what can access it, right? So as far as accessing goes, we've seen this before. We define a variable wow on line 4, and then on line 5, we say, hey, I would like to print out this line of text. I can access wow because it's in the scope, and then I would like to print out whatever the value of wow is, right? Here on line 5, it looks up and finds this variable wow. It pulls its value and it prints the text, right? So that's just basic variable access. And now we're going to learn a little bit about what scope does and how that affects it. JavaScript is lexically scoped. Man, that's a big word. But what does it mean? It means the location at which a variable is declared determines its scope. So literally, like we just said, right? Like wherever I write let global equals ear, like where that is written on the file makes a difference in what can access it. A variable that is declared outside of a function is globally scoped. It can be referenced from any line of code throughout the file. So line 6 here, we have global, which is equal to ear, right? Any function throughout this file can access it. This can be accessed on this console log on line 8, inside this function on line 10, right? Or on line 11 here, we have console log out inner. Look up what the value of global is. Go and get the value of this variable and print it out here. So that's pretty cool. That is global scoped. The entire globe has access to this variable. Even though a global variable can be referenced from anywhere in your code, the value assigned to the variable cannot be accessed until after the assignment operation occurs. So that's like a big fancy way of saying that we can define a variable like this, right? This is defining a variable. It's to say, hey, there's a variable called wait for it, right? Then we have a second thing that happens called assignment. Assignment is when you assign the variable a value. You say, hey, I want wait for it to equal here I am. The two aren't really mutually exclusive, right? Like we've seen this, you're assigning a value to a variable that already exists, right? But typically they're done on one line, right? Like I'm going to declare this variable and I'm going to assign it a value. So all this is saying is that the value assigned to the variable, this value can't be accessed until after it's assigned to the variable, right? Like if I try to look up here I am and wait for it, and I print it out before it's been given that value, it's going to be undefined. It's not going to be anything. Is that part clear? Any questions on that? Awesome. Cool. Moving right along. Okay, so that's global scope. Now we have functional scope. Values declared inside of a function are locally scoped. They're function scoped. They're scoped to the bounds of the function. So basically what it means is if I define a variable inside a function, the only place that that can be accessed is inside that function, right? It's kind of like I wall off with my curly braces here, the places that that variable can be accessed. So on line 6, I define message. I give it the value, I am so happy. On line 7, I can print out message. If I try to do the same thing on line 11, right? Try to say, hey, I'd like to access, I would like to print out message, not so fast. We can't reach into functions and grab their variables, right? It's scoped to the function. It's function scoped. What if a variable is defined locally and globally? Okay, cool, interesting. So we have a variable on line 3, message, think globally. And then on line 5, we start defining this function. And inside that function, we have a variable message, another variable message called act locally. And then on line 9, I am going to print out what message is. So the rule here is that JavaScript will look for the local message first. It's like we're going to check, we're going to have a narrower scope in our search first, right? We don't want to waste that much energy. We're going to just search the function. If the variable is there, by all means, pull it. If not, then we'll expand our scope, the scope of our search to be global, right? But the rule here is that if you're inside of a function and you're looking for a variable, we're going to use the variable defined inside that function first. What if a variable is defined locally and globally? Here we have message, once again on line 3. And then we have on line 6, MSG, act locally. If it can't find it locally, JavaScript will look at the scope outside the function, in this case, the global scope. So this is just an example of what we were just talking about, right? It's going to search for message. It's going to start off with a narrow scope of its search, searching locally. And then if it can't find it locally, it's going to expand the scope of its search. It's going to search globally. It's going to find it here and it's going to print it out. So the value of message when it prints it out on line 10 is think globally.
I have a quick question there. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, my question here is, if we I mean, we what is it? It's you determine the variable both. You know, like you define the variable, but what happens if the local variable in this case doesn't have a value assigned to it, and therefore it is undefined? Will it call my variable as undefined because it searched for it first locally, or if it is undefined, then it will look for the variable that has a value? Like,
yeah, really good question. So you're, just to clarify, you're talking about something like this, where
yeah.
it hasn't been given a value. Yeah, in this case, it would find this variable, and basically, there's no rule that like you can't look up the value of a variable like this. It just means that its value will be undefined.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, if we did this and we tried to console log it out, it would find the variable locally, and then it would print out undefined. Good question. Parameters are also locally scoped. Parameters are variables in a way as well. So if I have a parameter called message, it's going to be the same rule. It's going to be starting a search here locally, and it's going to find it locally. So whatever I pass in for message, whatever I pass in as an argument, that will be what we find and print out here. So on line 9, I pass in act locally. Message here is act locally. I want to access a variable called message. I'm going to start locally first. I'm going to find it here, and I'm going to print out act locally. And then the last part of this is nested functions. So how does it work when I have a function that's defined inside of another function, right? I have a function outer here, and inside of outer, I define another function called inner. So I have an outer function and an inner function. The rule here is that outer function, these variables can be accessed by this function inner, but not the other way around. You can't go into a function, but if your function is defined here, you can expand your scope to an outer function. So like we have global var, we have outer var, we have inner var. This function inner can access a global variable. It can access a variable defined on a function that it is defined inside of, that it is nested in, and then inner var, a variable that exists inside it. So like when we get to outer var, what'll happen is it'll say, okay, I need a value for this thing called outer var. Let's search locally first, and then we're going to expand the scope of our search a little bit, not globally, just sort of like a little bit further because we're inside of this other function. Okay, here's outer var, so I'm going to print out outer. Here we go. Here's another example. We have collision, which is globally scoped. We have a parameter on this outer function, so that's going to be locally scoped. And then we have a variable inside of inner, which is also locally scoped, but like even more specific, even smaller, right? Line 8, we want collision. We want a variable called collision. So first, we search locally, and we find it here, right? We print out inner. If we get rid of this variable, right, then on line 7, what happens is we say, okay, cool, I need a variable. Let's put this as a parameter here. I need a variable. Oh, no, this is supposed to be global. Sorry. This is going to show the global scope. So it's going to start off, I need a variable collision. I'm going to look for it locally. I can't find it. I'm going to look for it in the nested function, the outer function. Can't find it. I'm going to expand to the global scope. Hey, it's there. I'm going to print out collision global up at the top. Note that the inner function can access the scope of the outer function, but the opposite is not true. If I try to console log out inner var, which is defined inside of inner, right? If I try to access that from this outer function, I'll get reference error. I'll error out here. You can't reach inside a function to grab a variable. You can only reach outside to grab a variable. The inner function still looks for a local declaration of the variable name before looking at the next level of scope. So it's always going to try to find a variable of that name inside itself first. So even if it's not defined, even if it doesn't have a value assigned to it. Here, we have outer var defined as a parameter. And we can see on line 14, when this is called, it doesn't have a value passed in. So outer var here is undefined. Nevertheless, line 9, we're going to try to find the value of outer var. We're going to try to access it so we can print it out. We search the local scope and we find it and we print it out. So undefined and inner. Outer var is undefined, inner var is inner. Okay, and finally, block scope. This is specific to using let. So this let word that we've been using, the reason that it behaves in a certain way, the reason that it kind of was invented was for this. If true, right, we have a block here. We have an if statement, and then we have some curly braces. Anytime we have curly braces, we're going to create what's called a block, right? I'm going to define a variable block inside of this block. And then on line 6, I'm going to console log out block, right? And it's going to print out whatever the value of block is. Line 9, I'm going to try to reach inside this block here and print out block. But I'm going to get a reference error. Block is not defined. You cannot reach into and grab a variable inside of a block when we're using let. That's the whole reason why let is a thing. If I used var here, then this, I wouldn't get an error. This wouldn't matter. It would print out the exact same thing. But what this let keyword does is it basically says like, hey, I'm going to define some variables. If they're inside of a block, prevent code outside of this block from accessing it. Is that clear, or does anyone have any questions?
So the var block would work? Or just...
var, yes. Var block would work. Var doesn't care about block scoping.
Okay, thank you.
In 2015, they invented this let keyword because there were developers that wanted to do this. There were developers that wanted to prevent pieces of code outside of the block from getting in and accessing these variables.
What if you use const?
Const also block scopes. Const and let both uphold block scoping. Good question. Cool. The pre-ES6 version ignores block scoping. So basically what I just said, right? If we print out block, we can reach in because of this var, grab block and print out Jenny from the. Okay, scope best practices. Functions generally should not change globally scoped variables. Usually globally scoped variables are things that will never change. Things like days in the year, right? Something where you're like, okay, I'm going to have a variable that's going to define this, and I'm just going to use it throughout all my functions. It's not a good idea to change those things because you could mess up a bunch of functions that might depend on that. So like here, I have this variable always true. It's globally scoped. On line 4, we have don't mind me, which changes always true to false. And then I have this code down here, which is depending on always true being true. So this is going to kind of break our code when we start changing globally scoped variables. It's okay to define a new variable of the same name inside of a function like this. Creating a local variable, that's fine, but we don't want to manipulate, we don't want to change these values. Avoid cluttering the global namespace with lots of variables. Yeah, so like, I would say avoid having a ton of global variables. I would also say like try to make all of the names of your variables different and specific to what you need to do. Only declare variables globally if they need to be accessed globally. Otherwise, it's safer to declare variables in functions or blocks so you won't have to overwrite variables you won't overwrite them accidentally or access the wrong variable by mistake. Oh, excuse me. So recap, what did we talk about tonight? We talked about scope. What is scope? Scope is the idea that where you write your variable, where you define it, determines what can access it. There's three types of scope. There's global scope, which any function can access, any piece of code can access in your file. They have functional, local, which means like only that function can access it. Any piece of code within that specific function can access it. And then block, which pertains to like if blocks or while blocks or for loops. And that is specifically using the let keyword. We talked a little bit about the like how JavaScript will search from a local scope. It'll start local and then it'll go to global, or maybe it'll go to like an outer function to try to find a variable, and it'll use whichever the first one is that it finds. And then we also talked about scope best practices, which say basically like don't change the value of a global variable. It could cause some real headaches for you elsewhere in your code. Cool.